Good morning, and welcome to the first session of the Countdown to London Net Zero Conference. This session is the Designing Sustainable Neighbourhoods. My name is Ewuosho. I'm a trustee here at the Centre for London, and we're so pleased to have you with us. First of all, thanks again to Nick for those opening words, and to Shirley Rodriguez for those setting the context for this session. In this session, we're going to explore how London can adapt its existing buildings whilst designing resilient new infrastructure, at the same time encouraging sustainable behaviour, and finally how we can bring in new regulations to tackle carbon emissions. It's a broad and wide discussion, but thankfully I'll be joined by incredibly able guests. In terms of the format for this discussion, I will be asking each of the guests to introduce themselves, but also providing opening words. We'll then get a discussion going and then finally bring in questions from yourselves, the audience. Please use the hashtag London20. First, I'm pleased to be joined by John Bushell, design principal at KPF. Hi, John. Also by Maarten Hajer, director at Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University. Hi, Maarten. And finally by Julie Hirigoyen, Chief Executive at the UK Building Council. Thanks for joining me. Panelists, do please, I'm grateful for you to be here. Audience, please don't forget to ask questions. I'll get a feed through and I'll feed them in. And for those of you on YouTube, again, don't forget to use the hashtag London20. We'll try and get through as many questions as I can, but as I said, first, please, I would invite the guests to have an opening statement. So over to you, John, to start.
Good morning, everyone. KPF are very pleased to be part of this very vital conversation. I'm a design principal at KPF and have worked on many reuse and retrofit projects, including transforming the Unilever building on Blackfriars, South Bank Tower that used to be a Seafoot building at King's Reach, and working on a number at the moment. So I have spent a lot of my career being involved in this type of project. We've been talking about a race to net zero, and our view is that that race is a relay race, and it needs coordination from many different parties and groups, and that understanding needs to be made very clear. There's a first take on some of the legs of that relay race. There's the feasibility or concept stage, where clearly there needs to be much more openness to the potential for reuse or transformation of buildings. And this can be very imaginative. It doesn't have to be seen to be a negative to reuse something. In detailed design, the next leg, there's a choice of materials and how the building works. And obviously there's a huge amount of good work there, but it really needs to up its game. The construction phase, there needs to be a much bigger focus on the actual activity footprint of construction and to get the contractors to buy into the same agenda, and if not, to contribute their own reductions stage by stage. Operation, we all know, but here the big thing is to really understand how buildings are actually working, to have a lot more data capture and analysis, and to be able to adjust and to really think hard about how to reduce energy use. And then we've talked about reuse, but each time we reuse, we should design for further reuse. You know, what are the next uses? What are the next generations of things? And so that's an idea, I think, of radical flexibility. But we would say there are some key stages in the relay race that are missing at the moment. And one for us is the gap or the needing to link research to implementation of new materials. We could say part of the problem of climate change is one of material use. We want to reduce that use in carbon, and there are one or two things to hand, like timber, but we can't all use timber. There aren't enough forests, and in fact we know that trees take about 20 years before they're actively sequestering carbon. So we need a very diverse set of potential answers. We feel this needs a real intensification of links between material research and the construction industry. And we've just been given an example of how academic research can be made into the amazing effective delivery through the COVID vaccination. And you know, that research had been around for a long time, just as there is a great deal of research and thought about sustainable techniques and issues. And suddenly it became a matter of urgency and an exemplary delivery. Can we invent and kind of nurture the same type of urgency to bring many more materials, whether they're 3D printing or low carbon materials, through to actual use? And that links to what are the rules of the race. If one does want to use some of those interesting materials, in fact, there's a whole difficulty around certification. Can these be used? What's the safety, etc.? So there needs to be the accompanying, how can we make these things easy to use, to be accepted as used? And also that the rules of the game need to quite quickly be tightened. I mean, there's very good progress in planning and building control regulations. They're nowhere near what is required. If we wanted to say that the litmus test is to be Paris-proof, there's still quite a lot of room for the legislation to be increased. There are one or two other things. So clearly, we tax reuse projects here at 20%. So there's a disincentive to use them. That should be changed. And in fact, we should see these projects, the costs per square foot should be lower and should be part of a more general story about creating buildings at affordable rents, at affordable, accessible nature, to have social purpose added to this kind of manifesto for reuse. And last, you would say that we shouldn't try and all use the same solution, not only in terms of materials, but also in terms of vision. And the Excel spreadsheets, if they all tell us now to make every office building into residential, etc., we'll lose something. So there need to be keeping the idea of variety creates communities, whether that's variety of use, variety of costs, variety of solutions. The buildings we respect greatly are those like the Victorian warehouse or the terrace, etc., where they've been many things and will continue to be many things. So that idea of a wide variety that allows also the retention of cultural memory, of all sorts of other things. So it's not just about carbon. In a recent conversation, I was struck by how so much of this has been talked about for so long. I think if you look in London, there are reports about resilience and sustainability for probably over decades. So again, to use the relay race analogy, maybe we've had lots of practice runs, but we really need to try and make this the real run. How do we collectively make each of those stages real, and both set the rules that mean people all engage in that race, the incentives, and also then find great satisfaction in the layered answer that gives to our cities. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, John. That's a really helpful opener there, and I love the analogy of the relay. We all need to be involved, and finally your end about how we move away from the practice into the real run, right? Because this is real and it is happening, and we need to get together to do it. So thanks for that. Maarten, over to you.
Well, I think if that is the relay run, I would introduce the multiplier. So the topic we are addressing is so big. I mean, I'm a member of the International Resource Panel of UNEP, and so we do the math for how we deal with our natural resources and how we can reach the Paris Agreement goals. Basically, if you don't do everything at once, you won't reach your goals. So there's a recent paper in Nature Sustainability. There's 7 systems in a city that need to interact to be able to achieve net zero. So we have to address urban form. We have to think about energy conservation, and of course, in particular, in countries like ours, the shift to renewables, food, completely rethink our diet, mobility, and of course, people's awareness. But the good thing is that what we found out, there is a multiplier between these things, working on those things. So it looks as if you can never reach it, but the thing is, they not add up, they multiply. So if you would be able to imagine that we are going to go for London of sustainable neighborhoods and also work on that scale, you have the prospect of reaching your goals. So you have to leave planning for the dwelling as a single entity. You have to work for sustainable neighborhoods, because that is where that multiplier will work. That is where you will free up the space that allows you to have people in smaller apartments. It requires you to strategically invest in your social infrastructure just as much as in your ecological infrastructure, because that allows people to also live in the outdoors when it is really hot. So the parks, rethinking the high streets, are elements of a working net zero strategy. If you don't invest in the public domain, you cannot reach your net zero strategy. So for us, when we wrote the book Neighborhoods for the Future, we argued it is to be about a social and ecological urbanism. Now, the good thing about thinking about cities and neighborhoods in that way is that we can tap into that fantastic tradition of urbanism that we know for 100 years. How do cities work? How do people behave in cities? And connect that to sustainability issues. And it may be too obvious to say, but the risk is that we look at sustainability in too technical and too technocratic a term. And I would think, and that's what also our research shows, then you risk finding citizens on the other side of the street, of fighting. And then, of course, all these goals in 2030 and so forth are not going to be reached. So you have to find a way to engage people. And that means that it has to work for them. And that is what I suppose that social and ecological urbanism can be about. When we did the research in Toronto, there was a wonderful moment in Regent Park, which was a neighborhood which was crime-ridden. It was also an ecological disaster. And they have rebuilt it. And when we tried to find out why it worked on the scale and with so much success, we found out that it were the migrant communities that were crucial in making the whole thing work. And one activist, Surya Ibrahim, told us, I at some point decided, Toronto, this is where I want to fight my fights. And that sentence I found so fantastic, because what she basically said, it's about citizenship. It's not about, working along in a technocratic project for a net zero city. No, it is fighting for your own sake. And if you can see that as part of your success, I think these ambitious goals may be able to be actually achieved. I mean, they are stunningly ambitious. 2030 net zero. Praise London for setting that target, but it's going to be a race from the start to the finish. Now, one worry that we have with neighborhoods and making them work is that you, of course, create value. By intervening in the neighborhoods, you create value. And you need to think from the outset, how do we keep that value in the neighborhood? How do we avoid that value that is created goes out? That investment is brought in, people take their profits out. So to create a neighborhood value chain, imagine how that could work. Also organize, have the regulation in place is crucial for this to be an inclusive and just transition. And of course, when I say that the urban tradition is a wonderful one, let's not forget that the last 100 years, when we followed Le Corbusier and the modernists in rethinking our cities, they came to the front with this idea of a tabula rasa. Well, not again. Not again. How urgent the sustainability crisis may be, it's tabula scripta. It's people living these neighborhoods. And to acknowledge the social ecology of these neighborhoods and the needs of people and connect that with the dramatic need to act on the climate change that is manifest in our world today, that is the true challenge of the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Maarten. That's incredible. I'm increasingly struck by the idea that climate change is first sort of almost a psychological and anthropological challenge and a people-based challenge before it's a technological one. And I think insofar as we're trying to solve it purely technologically, we might miss the trick. Now, you and John have kind of picked on similar things and a trend that I'm going to try and draw out in a second, but it feels like we've asked some really difficult questions, which is great because we've got Julie here to try and answer them. So Julie, please, over to you.
No pressure. Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Julie Hirigoyen. I'm the Chief Exec, as you said, at UK Green Building Council. I'm also one of the commissioners on the London Sustainable Development Commission. So I'll try to draw from both of those, sort of wearing both of those hats, I suppose, for the context of today's session. Just to give you 2 minutes on UK Green Building Council. So we are a charity with a mission to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. So across all its guises and life cycle stages, which is suitably ambitious. So you'll forgive me if much of what I reference today relates to either buildings or kind of the built environment in its kind of larger form, as it were. I guess the first thing I wanted to say was, in terms of the sort of the nature of the topic that we're discussing today, it was really encouraging that we're looking at the neighbourhood level. I think, just as politics is always local, so is sustainable development, or so should it be. Cities, towns, neighbourhoods, communities are probably the best lens that we've got, or that we should take in trying to achieve sustainable outcomes in a meaningful way for people where they will be affected by those outcomes. And there's been a number of trends, I suppose, that we can draw from in the last 12 to 24 months that really highlight the role that local authorities, cities, towns, and various other sort of community groups need to play in us tackling this crisis, this climate crisis. Ipsos, Mori, and UK 100 did some research recently, I think just published last April, which suggested that 2 in 5 people actually believe their local authority is the best placed stakeholder to help initiate action on climate change, even higher actually in areas, sometimes up in northern regions, Yorkshire, Humber, 50%, up to 50% of people think, their regional and local councils are really the best fit to tackle climate change. That's much, much higher than those who believe it can just be left to government's responsibility, and those who think actually it's down to us as individuals. Of course, I would argue it's not any one of those. It's it's absolutely every stakeholder out there and every single one of us that needs to play a really significant role. But really interesting, I think, in terms of where the public trust is and where local bodies or locally representative bodies can step in and try and really tackle this. Now, obviously, they face a number of challenges in trying to do that, not least, decimated in terms of resources and skills, and a lot of the skills have been lost actually in planning and environment and sustainability type teams, and lack of clarity. In fact, in some cases, almost actively sort of blocking mechanisms from central government that are preventing local bodies from going further than national policy, and planning is a good example of that. Not enough investment and so on and so forth. But still, we see more and more cities committing to, it was mentioned just now, by Maarten, very, very ambitious target for London, 2030 net zero. Yet we're seeing many other cities doing the same. Manchester 2038, Bristol 2030, and the list goes on. There's almost a slight competition around the when, but there's no argument about the what. So about 3/4 of us in the UK live in a town or city that has a net zero target, or that has very, very ambitious policies on renewable energy, and that's much higher, of course, than sort of one could compare against global averages. Obviously, that's not enough. We need all cities to commit to at least halving their absolute emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero, much ahead of 2050, if at all possible. So it's useful to look at, and I welcome the analogy with Waste to Zero, because that is very much what that campaign is trying to do. UNFCCC backed, really put some ambition behind what those commitments need to be, and actually demonstrate that the action needs to start right now. That's really helpful. I suppose in the UK, I feel the Waste to Zero campaign doesn't have enough profile amongst the built environment industry, at least. So as UKGBC, we're very much promoting the Race to Zero. We're encouraging our members and various others to join the race, giving them support on what that means. It's not just aggressive, ambitious targets. It's actually taking action pretty quick. And actually, it's deeply and directly relevant to buildings and the built environment. So we've established ourselves as an accelerator to the Race to Zero. We think it's the best kind of global show in town. But we also think that those commitments need to drop down to the level of individual buildings or individual portfolios. And I think all too often with an organisational wide commitment like Race to Zero, it's quite hard then to drill into the detail of what those organisations are doing on specific aspects. Maarten, you mentioned several different dimensions one needs to look at a neighbourhood level or at a city level. Buildings is such a critical part of that. And we often see Race to Zero signatories not having a plan for buildings. So there is also a need for commitment specifically around net zero carbon buildings, and we need to be really clear what that means. We have supported the World Green Building Council net zero carbon buildings commitment, and primarily that will require signatories to commit to occupying net zero carbon buildings in operation by 2030, and in some months to come to addressing their embodied. The reason why I think that's so important is that signalling market demand is one clear, sure way of changing the marketplace. As representing the sort of built environment industry, I want to see more heat and pressure from the customer coming onto those developers, investors, managing agents and agents. And that's still a little bit murky. So whilst government regulation is increasing and planning might be tightening a little bit, or that's slightly debatable, occupiers could really drive the market demand, and a lot of that could be public and private sector, not just thinking corporate. So signatories to Race to Zero really ought to consider their role on buildings. And then the last thing I was just going to flag, of course, it's not just about climate change and resilience and adaptation. Crucial though those are, right? They're probably the most pressing and enormously important, as we know. But as the London Sustainable Development Commission, we recently published a report on London's performance against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we were really surprised to find that this was one of the first and probably the most extensive reports or research efforts that we have found out there for a major capital city to actually take the SDGs and really plot, where are we against all of these indicators, and because time is ticking, and should we not, as a city, be using those as a decision-making framework or governance framework? And the analysis, of course, the most interesting bit of the analysis suggests that you can't look at any of the issues in isolation. They're hugely interdependent, and actually, it's in those interdependencies and taking a really holistic view of particularly policy-making decisions at a local neighbourhood and city level, that we find the really interesting and the most challenging, relationship. So, we need much more active engagement with local people, with Londoners, particularly with communities whose voices aren't always heard. But many of those will be most impacted by whether it's fuel poverty or poor air quality or climate change impacts and overheating and so on and so forth. So we've got this sort of concertina effect of these issues bumping up against one another and really, really harming and affecting people's lives. And that's the bit that I think at this level of thinking and planning and decision making, we really have a responsibility to look at those interdependencies and to really try to iron those out and try and achieve, multiple wins by addressing one or two issues much, much more cleverly. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions.
Super helpful. Thank you so much, Julie. If I may just stay with you, I think we've talked about how grand the challenge is, and you've talked very helpfully as well about the SDGs more broadly. And John and Maarten have talked about the interplay. Maarten talks about the multiplier, and John talks about the relay. I guess the lens I want to sort of ask is, what is the opportunity for the kind of pandemic recovery to start to shift some of these things? So your emphasis, for example, around localized, the neighborhoods growth, and the cities, and almost the race, between the cities to get to 2030. So what is the opportunity for the pandemic in terms of shifting some of that focus and some of that locus from the national to the local, and how do you see that playing out?
It's a really great question, and I wish I knew the answer. And we are all very much in speculation mode, aren't we? But there's some interesting, there are some interesting things that happened through the lockdowns that we can draw on to actually challenge our perception of where did change really occur. Now clearly, emissions from commuting fell dramatically, right, during the lockdowns. Transport accounts for almost 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, so that's huge. If we're trying to address that, that's enormous. But the flip side to that is that we've all been sat in our very inefficient, leaky homes trying to heat them whilst we work from home the whole time. And actually, there was a research conducted by WSP, one of our members last year, which really pitted that poor energy efficiency against the commuting wins. And actually, the carbon footprint is likely to have been increased by the fact that we've had to heat our leaky homes on a sort of massive scale. So there were assumptions that we might make that actually look that the roads are quiet and emissions are down because transportation is down, which are masking an impact somewhere else. Just to finish on that note, I think there's a really interesting area now, whereas in the future, ideally post-pandemic, if that ever happens, we return to a working style where we're not all coming into the office the whole time. This reliance on staff and colleagues to work from home increases the responsibility of the employer to ensure that they have the right conditions, safe, warm, not too hot. In fact, some of my staff have been coming into the office because the biggest reason was overheating in some of their residences. So there is an interesting correlation between employer responsibility and actually then trying to tackle something like home retrofit, which we've got so far to go on, and whether there could be a case for employers actually supporting their staff with some of that if they're expecting them to be at home. But I think that the wider piece on what does it do for communities and neighbourhoods, and we've got all sorts of issues to tackle there. High streets with empty shops on them. How are we going to bring those back to life? We've got challenges around permitted development, changes of use. We've got probably tons of space that's not the right spec for what we need it for, but yet, we don't want to tear buildings down and start again. I think there's lots of opportunities, but they require us to think quite differently about than we are now in terms of zoning, planning, regulations, and so on.
Thanks for that, Julie. Really appreciated. And we'll come to you now, John, if that's okay. Julie rightly kind of points the finger at our leaky homes, and she also talked about sort of pressure from customers and the market demand and how we move some of that stuff forward. In your opening, you talked about existing sort of retrofits being a huge challenge. I mean, we know that. By 2050, 85% of the buildings that will be there already are existing. So surely the biggest challenge is in that retrofit space. So, how do you see that challenge moving forward? And what is the role for customers? Me and my leaky flat. How do I engage with that challenge in a meaningful way to move that forward?
Thank you. I think if we start maybe with the leaky office space and then go to the flat. So. I think it was Julie who mentioned that there needs to be perhaps education or activation from funders and clients, but we think that's probably definitely happening. So big funds are now extremely aware of being compatible with the Paris Agreement, and every single question we get in any large project is now, does this have good long-term credentials with energy, etc.? So we think that is happening, and in terms of the workplace, it's part of the responsibility they have to get good employees. They're being judged by what their policies are. In terms of housing projects, it's about whether they're fundable and whether they're a good investment. So I think there's been a huge change there, and the pandemic, to an extent, has helped everyone see there's no single rule anymore. You can't say, well, what we always do is this or that. You know, everything has been shown to need to change. And I think local authorities also have discovered a huge agency that they didn't know they had. You know, the streets have been transformed, various things have happened very quickly, they've got together and responded. So I think the pandemic will be helpful in the idea that there needs to be a new pattern. And funders and occupiers are demanding more. So the question is, you know, how does one do it, which is a huge challenge. And it needs to be, I think, a mixture of certainly within commercial buildings, anything to do with making them fit for being used in the future, good ventilation, etc., entirely overlaps with good carbon practice. So there's a kind of a coincidence or reinforcing, a multiplier, I think, as Maarten said, of all of these factors are pointing to the same solution, whether it's sort of being able to use your house easily but without the use of carbon. Residential in its own right, that flat question, I do think we've been producing a lot of the wrong sort of homes. I don't think the last 10, 15 years of very minimized flats are going to be judged very kindly over time. And clearly there is an art to designing those properly, and now there'll be an art to finding out how to best modify them. So I think that needs to be worked through. And for the future, it's clear that there needs to be, I mean, we're looking at projects where it's all about avoiding that overheating in small spaces. You know, we've set up quite a difficult problem to solve. And so we'll need to think very hard about that. I mean, I think let's make sure we don't repeat the problem anymore, and then go back to see how we can imaginatively and creatively and effectively make those things work. Natural ventilation is a big thing. So all the single aspect, and you know, there's a whole set of things. So it's got to be around allowing that to happen. It may even be the introduction of new ways of making sure there's a ventilation path through these buildings.
Thanks, John. Super helpful. I'll just come to you, Maarten. You very helpfully mentioned around the multiplier, but then you talked about the neighborhood value chain. So in a world in which we've individually sorted out our retrofit issues, as John has pointed out, how does the neighborhood value chain come together to create that multiplier effect that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, we spotted that neighborhoods that successfully transform often have actors with skin in the game, so that have at least a 30-year commitment to that neighborhood. So a housing corporation could be one like that, or a good investor that wants to keep up its rental buildings. But if that's not in place, then you have to be careful, because of course, if you create value by creating really nice high street, of course, where is that extra value that you create going to? So to the extent that, for instance, you now have a problem with empty real estate, I mean, if it's possible to sort of create an association around that empty space that allows you to rethink and then keep in that association that value, that is, of course, would be a wonderful thing. I mean, London is deeply urban. It might be more difficult, but we've seen that, for instance, in southern Germany. So in Vauban, they have shops are part of cooperatives. So that if the shop's doing well, I mean, the value stays in the cooperative. If people live in a cooperative building and they leave, they get their money back and they get some interest on top of it. But the extra value that is created because that cooperative has built such a nice building remains in that neighborhood, which allows them also to rent out apartments at social rents. I mean, the people that tapped in the money have their own apartments, but they have another sort of 20% that is social housing that they generated within the cooperative that works, but the money remains in the neighborhood. No, I think that's a big challenge. You know, on that issue of the post-COVID response, I mean, again, we've rediscovered our neighborhoods. We've rediscovered our streets. But what you also see, that people say, okay, hey, I'm working more at home. I want more square space. Well, I mean, if that's the direction, we're done, right? So is it possible to imagine that new working week where people work more, but not from home, but from their neighborhood? What would that allow in terms of rethinking the high street? Is it possible to replace the commercial space by sort of collective spaces where people could work? You know, they would pay for their workspace, but that would prevent them from traveling to the downtown. That is, again, sort of organizing the social infrastructure, and also, of course, people from the neighborhood pay for the places they rent, so that money remains in that place. And I mean, sometimes we forget the most obvious things. So sometimes people say the 20th century was about getting around. If you really were successful, you know, Bali, that was, you know, I had worked so hard, I was a week on Bali. The 21st century is about refining the natural, and that's also about creating places that are great to stay in, that you don't want to move away from. And look at the 20th century, we've allowed the car in the city to an extent that's totally bizarre. And if we can get the car out and mobility back in, again, we create a space that can be reused. It's a real estate value that you create. And finally, perhaps on that issue that John was discussing about the retrofits, in terms of natural resources, retrofitting buildings with rock wool will be disaster. We need to find bio-based materials to insulate our homes. Rock wool is heated rock. The CO2 in insulation material is a significant factor. The bio-based materials, we are now finding out, just now finding out, often have the same insulation capacities. So achieving net zero London will have implications for the countryside, for what we grow there. We have to be aware that indeed we need timber. Actually, our calculations are that we do have the timber available for the urbanization wave that's still ahead of us, and to do it sustainably and not have monofunctional forests like the Forestry Commission erected 150 years ago. But it's not only about timber, it's not only about wood, it's also about these bio-based materials for insulation. And that is for London, of course, a crucial sphere to be very, very aware of the CO2 implications.
Thanks, Maarten. That's super helpful. Really interesting link, actually, separately around the climate change problem and solving that, and extraction. So, for example, if you look at sort of battery and the sort of the lithium and so on required, you actually have to sort of find that somewhere. And you've got another example around rock wool and extracting that. And so, you know, I've seen some good work trying to mimic and emulate a similar kind of sort of properties from those extraction materials into real life. So we're going to go into some Q&A. I think the first question is actually a bit of almost a point of order for you, Maarten. I think in your opening line you mentioned a book, and I think some of the audience want to know what that book is. What's the title of the book, and indeed the author? That'd be helpful.
Thank you so much. This is what's called
Neighbourhoods for the Future, by our very own Maarten Hajer, and I'm sure in all good bookshops. So there you go. So let me just have a look at some of these questions. So new materials were mentioned. Is there a potential for old traditional materials to make a comeback using modern techniques and practices? I'm going to go to John for that question first, and see where we get to.
There was certainly there's the discussion we've been having about using materials appropriately. So traditional techniques use materials very carefully, very appropriately, and we could learn a lot from that. Even, for instance, the cladding with all of the silicon joints and things are its point of weakness. We remove all of that, and joints and junctions, and so you can learn a lot for sure. I would still think that we need to be trying to make sure we're not extracting raw materials. I stand corrected, Maarten, about timber. My apologies, but it still feels that there should be a range of answers, and some of that should be. I love the bio-based insulation. I think that it should be a range of things, and I think while fine to say yes, there will be a part in traditional techniques. In order to get this huge change to happen, we're really going to have to find new things. So we would put, I think, a lot of hope and faith in implementing newly found and sensible things. And I think it's also fantastic to link the city to agriculture and to the landscape. And indeed, there's always been that link. Some of our forward-thinking clients, Grosvenor, for instance, are looking at urban agriculture and multi-story farms and all sorts of things, and so there might be a parallel. In Maarten's "Everything Has to Happen at Once," maybe another of those things is how agriculture can be transformed somewhat, and indeed then there's more room for other things to be provided from the land. So I think it makes. I mean, we on 81 Newgate Street, which is our kind of test case at the moment, we've got to actually below Paris-proof levels for embodied carbon. But we know that it would be double that number if it was a new build. So there's still this fundamental issue that the biggest move was to reuse a building, and then we're reusing all the stone on the building. We're not trying to find any new stone. So I think it's a really big challenge. And probably requires more fresh thinking than it does going back to the past, but certainly most of what we're doing at the moment can definitely evolve.
John, thanks, John. That's great, super helpful. There's a couple of questions around the localization and decentralization, so I'm going to try and combine them. A couple of questions kind of disparaging about national government's efforts to retrofit. Do we need to devolve powers to the local level? And what are the hyper-green local initiatives can we suggest and come about at a local level? I think I'm going to place those to Julie, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm very happy to spend a bit of time talking about disparaging comments about central government policy on home retrofit. We have seen speechless, frankly, in terms of some of the U-turns that we've witnessed in the last sort of 12 months alone, let alone the kind of long tail of historic, failures, policy failures in that space, and it leaves us slightly scratching our heads as to why this should be such a challenging. It is a challenging area of policy, but it's also hugely urgent. And the evidence from this last round of the Green Homes grants was there was real appetite. The demand was definitely there. Increasingly, the demand is there. So I think we clearly need to see a much more sophisticated and long-term interconnected series of policies, not just a one-size-fits-all. Here's a sort of grants or green funding available for those who want to do some works on their homes. That isn't the only thing that will make people either decide to retrofit or not retrofit their home. We need transactional triggers and incentives, reduced stamp duties or increased lower mortgage rates, or lower rates of VAT on retrofitted homes or refurbished offices and so on. There's a multitude of different ways that we need to sort of be driving that forwards, and we need probably a national communications campaign. retrofitting our homes, as we sit here in the UK, is in the top 10 things, probably number 6 of what we could do in terms of reducing our own carbon footprint. We know that citizens are getting more and more concerned about reducing their own carbon footprint, and yet, poll after poll, we're told they don't even think of that in their top 30. So we've got this kind of big mismatch between what people think they need to do and actually what they commit to doing in their personal lives. So that's the kind of backdrop to the second part of the question, though, which I find quite exciting. In spite of that sort of frankly vacuum of central government leadership on the home retrofit issue, there are some exciting things happening at a local level. And I think particularly with the growth in green finance and the banks starting to mobilize themselves in particular around wanting to accelerate this transition, there is real opportunity emerging. We're doing a lot of work with cities, both in Europe and in the UK, London, Leeds, various others, doing some really exciting stuff. Nottingham with the energy sprung trials. There are some pockets of excellence emerging, and actually increasingly, I think that local lens, back to my point about, that is a trusted delivery partner for many kind of citizens, much more trusted perhaps than, going straight to marketplace and finding a builder or someone that they need to trust to come in and do some intervening works on their home. So that building on that trust and actually teaming up with sort of green finance products and finding ways to kind of localize some of that challenge, I think is we're going to continue to see some quite exciting developments in that space. But that doesn't let central government off the hook, in my view. We absolutely have to crack that nut quickly.
Thanks a lot, Julie. And no, there's no danger of letting central government off the hook. I'm aware that we have a poll for audience members, and whilst we prepare for that, can I just have Maarten 30 seconds to talk about the political challenge around reducing consumption? Just 30 seconds on that. So we've done everything else. Now we need us to consume less as a whole. How do we go about tackling that challenge? And in the background, we'll prep the poll for the audience to get engaged.
Thanks. That 30 seconds to think about it. I once spotted the impact of meat, and the Guardian journalist said, "Oh, so are you in favor of a meat tax?" That's what journalists then how they reframe the issue. But new diets are absolutely crucial, and if you see the bizarre way in which we have industrialized our food, it is about more than climate. It's about ethics. And I suppose interconnecting those and also having more sort of footage, basically, of how our food is produced would have an impact on how people perceive what they eat. So it's not taking away the burger from people. It is about responsible diets. Is that